Snowstorms, it turns out, are not just meteorological events that trap people physically, they have the power to ensnare emotions, ideas, and decisions that one would never have anticipated. I learned this profound lesson on a bitterly cold December evening at the family cabin. My husband, Thomas, was unexpectedly called away for business at the last minute. Left to my own devices, I decided to head up to the cabin alone to ensure everything was in order before the next storm arrived. Jack, Thomas's son from his previous marriage, offered to accompany me, stating that he could use the fresh air. At the time, I didn't give his offer much thought. However, the storm hit far sooner than predicted, and the snow piled up with astonishing speed, rendering escape impossible. The cabin's antiquated heater sputtered and died, leaving only a small fire to provide any semblance of warmth during the frigid night. It was nearly as cold inside as it was in the blizzard outside. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so that I can continue sharing with you these captivating and genuine tales. Don't forget to watch this video until the very end and like it, as this story is truly intriguing. Your support means the world to me. We need to save heat, Jack explained, his breath visible in the faint light. Reluctantly, we grabbed blankets and settled on the couch together. Initially, it felt strange and overly intimate, but as the hours passed, the bone-chilling cold made us forget our discomfort. The storm howled ferociously outside, snow falling relentlessly, and the fire gradually weakened. By dark, the furnace had completely ceased functioning. We huddled closer together under the blankets, attempting to cling to whatever warmth we could muster. "I guess it's colder in here," I remarked, tightening my blanket around me. Jack nodded grimly. "If the fire goes out, we will freeze," he said. His words, seemingly unrelated to the weather, sent a shiver down my spine. The storm had caught us off guard, leaving us without electricity, mobile service, and any means of escape. Jack stood up to add more wood to the fire. As he did so, he looked at me and said, "This should keep us warm for a little while, but we need to stay close to keep our bodies warm." I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his expression serious yet understanding. "We should share blankets until the storm passes." I wanted to object, to say that we would be fine on our own, but the cold was undeniable, and I knew he was right. "Okay," I said softly. He found the heaviest blankets he could and spread them on the couch. I joined him and sat awkwardly beside him. "Is this okay?" he asked, his tone cautious. I nodded and averted my gaze. "It's okay." At first, it was physically and emotionally uncomfortable. I was acutely aware of every inch of distance between us. But as time wore on, the cold pushed us closer together, and I began to feel less self-conscious about the situation. "Are you warmer now?" Jack inquired gently, his breath visible in the dim light. "Yes," I said, though my voice quivered. The silence that ensued was thick, broken only by the howling of the wind outside. Finally, Jack spoke. "The storm is worse than I expected," he remarked. I nodded. "It's been years since I've seen anything like this." He leaned back, a serious look in his eyes. "I used to love coming up here as a kid. My mom and I would stay for days." His mention of his mother startled me, as Jack rarely spoke about her. "You must have been very close," I responded. "Yeah," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She made this place feel like a home." I felt a pang in my chest. I had tried to fill that role after marrying Thomas, but I had always felt like an outsider. "I'm sorry if I haven't measured up," I said softly. Jack glanced at me, perplexed. "What do you mean?" "I know I'm not her," I stuttered. "And I understand how difficult it must have been for you to have me in your life." He shook his head. "Ava, you've been kinder to me than I deserved." The sincerity in his voice caught my breath. Time passed, and the fire continued to dwindle. Jack moved closer, tightening the covers around us. "Cold?" he asked. "I'm okay," I said, my teeth chattering slightly. "Here," he replied, placing his arm around me. At first, I tensed, but the warmth was immediate and palpable. As the chill subsided, I gradually leaned into him. "You're like a human heater," I said, attempting to lighten the mood. He chuckled. "I guess I'm good for something." We sat in silence for a while, the storm raging outside. The intimacy of the situation seemed almost overwhelming. As the night progressed, I became more at ease with Jack, and the walls that had previously separated us began to crumble. "Tell me something about yourself," he requested abruptly. I looked up at him, surprised. "Like what?" "Anything," he said. I thought for a moment. "I used to want to be a painter," I explained. "But life got in the way. I got a job, and I let my ambition slip away." Jack's expression relaxed. "You didn't have to abandon what makes you happy." His words stirred something within me that I hadn't felt in a long time. "How about you?" I inquired, shifting the subject. "What did you want to be?" He grinned slightly. "An architect. I used to draw detailed blueprints for homes and castles. My mother always said I had the imagination for it." "What happened?" I asked. He exhaled. "Life got in the way." His sentiment mirrored mine, and I sensed an unspoken kinship between us, a shared sense of loss for our unfulfilled dreams. By the next morning, the storm had passed, and sunlight streamed through the glass windows, casting a golden glow over the icy countryside. Jack was already awake, stoking the fire back to life. As I sat up, he returned my gaze. "Morning," he said pleasantly. "Morning," I answered, tightening the blanket around me. The uneasiness from the night before resurfaced, but this time it was centered around the unspoken tension between us rather than the physical discomfort. "We should be able to leave once the roads are clear," he said nonchalantly. "Good," I replied immediately, despite the fact that a part of me didn't want to leave the warmth and intimacy of the cabin. Later, as we prepared to leave, I couldn't help but wonder if the storm had truly changed our relationship or if it was all just in my imagination. When we returned home from the cabin, I expected the strange tension to subside. However, as we unpacked our belongings and settled back into our familiar surroundings, I realized that something had indeed changed. Jack began to avoid me, retreating to his room or leaving the house for extended periods of time. He would only communicate when spoken to directly. I told myself that the distance would help us return to normal, but I couldn't suppress the knot in my stomach whenever I saw him in the corridor or heard his voice from another room. One evening, as I was cleaning the dishes, Jack entered the kitchen. He lingered in the doorway, as if debating whether to leave. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to maintain a cheerful tone. "Yes," he replied, walking further into the room. "I just wanted to say thank you for handling everything at the cabin." I wiped my hands, taken aback by his sincerity. "You don't need to thank me. You're the one who kept us alive." He chuckled gently. "I still appreciate it." Our gazes locked for a brief moment, and I sensed a renewed connection between us. The tipping point occurred late one night. My mind was racing, and I couldn't fall asleep. I went downstairs to make some tea and found Jack in the dimly lit living room, reading a book. "Are you up late?" I asked, surprised. He looked up, his expression softening. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Me neither," I said as I sat across from him. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the clock in the background. Finally, Jack closed his book and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "May I ask you something?" he said cautiously. "Of course," I replied. "Did it feel different in the cabin?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with significance. My pulse raced as I considered my response. "Yes," I muttered. Jack nodded slowly, lowering his gaze. "I thought it was just me, but it wasn't," I said, my voice barely audible. The stillness that followed was deafening, and neither of us made a move to break it. Eventually, Jack stood up and sat beside me. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said, "but I can't stop thinking about it." I hesitated before admitting, I can't either. At first, I didn't resist when he leaned in. The kiss was tentative at first but quickly grew more intense. In that moment, I realized we had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. After that night, we tried to avoid each other, pretending that nothing had happened. But the attraction between us was too powerful to ignore. One evening, when Thomas had left for a week-long excursion, Jack and I were alone in the kitchen. The air between us crackled with tension. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice faltering. "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. "No one needs to know," he added. "It's not that simple," I murmured, leaning against the counter. "Maybe it is," he said, his hand brushing against mine. When his lips touched mine again, all my doubts momentarily vanished. Our relationship became increasingly complicated, and we found it nearly impossible to keep our secret. I became hyper-aware of the people around us, especially Clara, who began to notice changes in my behaviour. "You seem different," she said one morning, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "More alive," I laughed, attempting to brush it off. "I've just been getting more sleep." "Maybe there's someone or something you're not telling me about," she taunted, her eyes knowingly piercing. Her comments lingered in my mind, adding to the mounting tension. Greg's interest in Jack also grew, which only made matters worse. During a dinner party, Greg confronted Jack in the kitchen. "So, Jack," Greg said, swirling his wine glass. "What's it like being here with Ava?" Jack replied cautiously, "It's all right." "Just all right?" Greg pressed, his voice light but probing. "She's a lovely woman," he smirked. I excused myself before the conversation could turn more heated, but I knew Greg suspected something more was going on. As time passed, our covert connection became more and more difficult to conceal. Jack and I started sneaking around more frequently, seizing every opportunity for a moment alone. One evening, as we sat in the garden, Jack turned to me, his expression serious. "What are we doing, Ava?" he asked. I sighed and stared at the starry flowers. "I don't know," I admitted. "I really don't want to hurt anyone." "You're not," he said immediately. "But this is complex." He reached for my hand, gripping it firmly. "I'm willing to take the chance if you are." His words sparked a mixture of excitement and fear within me. I knew the risks, but I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Our lives had taken on a double existence. During the day, we pretended to be a normal family, and Thomas had no idea. But at night, we tiptoed around each other, cherishing the fleeting moments that felt like precious gold. The excitement was palpable, as was the danger. Every exchanged glance or touch carried the weight of 1,000 questions. Who would notice? Who would tell? And what would happen if they did? One afternoon, while Thomas was at work, Jack and I were alone in the living room. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, giving the room a beautiful golden hue. I sat on the couch, lost in thought, as Jack rested on the armrest beside me. His hand touched mine, and I looked nervously at the door. "Someone might come home," I said. Clara texted. "She's taking Thomas to the fundraiser," Jack replied. His words reassured me, allowing me to relax for a moment. But as Jack moved closer, the sound of the front door opening made my pulse race with fear. "Ava," Thomas called from the hallway. We quickly sprang apart, my heart pounding as Thomas walked into the room. He stopped in the doorway, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's going on in here?" he asked, his eyes darting between the two of us. "Just reading," I said quickly, holding up a book, as if it could shield me from his gaze. Jack nodded, maintaining a calm expression. I was just about to head out. Thomas stared at us for a long moment, then shrugged. "All right." I thought I heard voices. Once he left the room, I let out the breath I had been holding. "That was too close," I whispered to Jack. "Too close," he agreed, his jaw tight. The following days became even more complicated. Greg's behaviour grew more intrusive, and his curiosity about Jack seemed to intensify after Thomas mentioned that his son was staying with us. One evening, during a dinner party at our house, Greg cornered Jack in the kitchen again. "So, Jack," Greg said, swirling his wine glass. "What's it like staying here with Ava?" Jack's posture stiffened, and he glanced briefly at me across the room. "It's fine," he replied cautiously. "Just fine." Greg pressed. "She's a lovely woman, isn't she?" Jack clenched his jaw. "She is." Greg smirked, clearly relishing the discomfort he was causing. "I hope you're not giving her too much trouble." Before the conversation could escalate further, I stepped in, keeping my tone polite but firm. "Greg, do you mind helping Thomas in the dining room?" "Of course," Greg said with a half smile before leaving the room. I turned to Jack once we were alone. "What was that about?" "Nothing," Jack replied, though his expression told a different story. "He's just being Greg." But I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg suspected more than he let on. As our relationship continued, it became increasingly difficult to keep the secret from those around us. Jack and I found ourselves sneaking around even more often, sharing stolen moments in the early mornings or late at night. One evening, as we sat together in the garden, Jack turned to me, his expression serious. "What are we doing, Ava?" he asked again. I stared at the moonlit flowers, unsure of how to respond. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I don't want to hurt you." "You're not," he said. "But the weight of the situation is clear." He reached for my hand again, his grip strong and reassuring. "I'm willing to risk it if you are." Despite the risks, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. We persisted in our covert relationship, leading a double life. Every moment of our illicit love heightened the risks. When Thomas was around, we played the role of a normal family, but at night, we navigated a world filled with secrets, constantly on guard, wondering when everything would come crashing down. One afternoon, while Thomas was at work, Jack and I were alone again. The sunlight streaming through the curtains seemed to bring a sense of calm, but I knew it was just an illusion. Jack leaned beside me, his hand brushing mine again. "I'm not sure how much longer we can keep this up," I whispered, my voice tinged with anxiety. He nodded, his expression grave. "We'll figure it out. But we can't keep pretending nothing's going on." Just then, the sound of the front door opening again made us freeze. "Ava," Thomas called from the hallway. My heart sank into my stomach as we quickly pulled apart. The weight of our actions hung over us like a dark cloud. Thomas walked into the room, oblivious to what had just happened. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between the two of us. "Just reading," I said, trying to keep my composure. I grabbed a nearby book, attempting to appear normal. Jack nodded in agreement, though his eyes betrayed the underlying tension. I was about to head out. Thomas gave us a curious look before shrugging. All right. Once he left, I could feel the panic subsiding, but the guilt remained. Jack and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken words lingering in the air. We both knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. As the days wore on, the tension continued to mount. Greg started noticing more things: strange glances, awkward silences, and his behaviour became even more suspicious. Finally, it reached a breaking point when Thomas confronted me one evening. "Ava, what's going on?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. I froze, taken aback by the question. "What do you mean?" "You've been acting strange," Thomas said, his tone growing more insistent. "And Jack, he's been acting strange too. Is there something I should know?" The weight of his words settled on me, and I knew that it wouldn't be long before the truth came out. The strain of keeping our secret relationship had become too much to bear. Jack and I had reached a breaking point, and the constant tension weighed heavily on both of us. Our stolen moments, the looks we shared, the closeness we tried to hide, it was all becoming unbearable. One evening, after another close call, we found ourselves arguing in the kitchen. "This is getting too dangerous," I said, my voice rising. "Someone is going to figure it out." Jack stepped closer, his expression softening. "We can handle it." "Can we?" I countered, my frustration boiling over. "It feels like everything is falling apart." Jack's voice was steady, but his eyes reflected the same fears I had. "I don't want to lose you, Ava." "I don't want to lose you either," I admitted, feeling the weight of the situation. But even as we reconciled, I couldn't shake the feeling that our time together was running out. The breaking point came one afternoon when Thomas returned home unexpectedly during one of our secret moments. Jack and I had been in the garden, our voices low, as we discussed our next steps. "We need to stop this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's getting too risky." "Do you really want to stop?" Jack asked, his eyes searching mine for an answer. Before I could respond, the sound of Thomas's voice made us jump. "Ava," he called out from inside. We scrambled apart, panic rising in my chest as I heard his footsteps approaching. "Just getting some air," I said quickly, forcing a smile as Thomas appeared in the doorway. His eyes narrowed as he studied us both carefully. "What's going on out here?" "Just talking," I said, trying to keep the situation calm. Thomas gave us a suspicious look, but after a long moment, he shrugged. "All right." And then, without another word, he left the room. As I exhaled in relief, I couldn't help but feel the walls closing in on us. "That was too close," I whispered to Jack. "I know," he agreed, his jaw tight with frustration. The next day, Greg's interference escalated even further. He showed up unannounced at the house, his demeanor smug as he greeted Thomas. "Greg," Thomas said, surprised by his sudden appearance. "What brings you by?" "Oh, I just thought I'd check in," Greg said, his gaze darting between Jack and me, clearly studying us. "I've been noticing some interesting dynamics around here lately." My stomach sank at his words, but Thomas, oblivious to the tension, laughed it off. "Off, Greg. You've always been one for gossip," Thomas said with a chuckle. "Come on, let's have a drink." As Thomas led Greg away to the study, I turned to Jack, my voice low. "We are running out of time," I said. "I know," Jack said, his face grim. "But I'll figure something out." That night, Jack came to me with a plan. "I'll talk to Greg," he said, his voice resolute. No, I said, panic rising in my chest. You can't trust him. I'm not asking for his trust, Jack replied, his voice steady. But if I don't do something, he'll ruin everything. Despite my protests, Jack left the house that night, determined to confront Greg and put an end to his threats. He met Greg at a bar far away from our house, hoping for some semblance of privacy. This is your last chance, Greg said, sipping his drink with an air of finality. Leave town or I'll destroy both of you. Jack leaned in, his voice cold. You think you can control me or Ava? You're pathetic. Greg's smirk faltered, and he leaned in closer. Careful, kid. You don't want to make an enemy of me. Jack didn't back down. You already are. Greg stormed out of the bar, his threats lingering in the air. When Jack returned home, he was pale but determined. It's done, he said. What did you do? I asked, fear in my voice. Nothing illegal, Jack replied, though his tone was evasive. But the peace didn't last. The following morning, Thomas received an anonymous email with damning evidence, enough to unravel everything. Thomas stormed into the kitchen, holding his phone, his face pale with fury. Ava, he barked, slamming the phone on the counter. What is this? I froze, my eyes darting to the phone screen. The subject line was ominous, the truth about your wife and your son. Below it, a series of photos captured our stolen moments together. The captions were even worse, filled with venom and accusations. This has to be a mistake, I stammered, my voice betraying me. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he read the email. Don't insult my intelligence, Ava. I've known something was off for weeks now. Just then, Jack entered the room, his face going pale as he saw the scene unfolding. What's going on? Jack asked cautiously. Thomas turned on him, his anger boiling over. You know exactly what's going on. You've been sneaking around with my wife. Thomas, just listen to me, Jack said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Don't you dare tell me to listen, Thomas shouted. I welcomed you into my home, and this is how you repay me. It's not that simple, Jack said, his voice steady but filled with tension. Not that simple. Thomas laughed bitterly. You seduced her, didn't you? Manipulated her the same way you manipulate everyone else. That's not what happened, I said, my voice trembling. Thomas, please let's talk about this. Thomas cut me off, his voice cold. I trusted you, Ava. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for him. Before I could react, Thomas turned back to Jack. You're no son of mine. Pack your things and get out of my house. Before Jack could say anything, the doorbell rang. I froze, dreading the worst. When Thomas opened the door, Sabrina stood there with a smug expression. Sabrina, Jack said, his voice filled with disbelief. What are you doing here? I came to deliver the rest of the truth, Sabrina said as she walked past Thomas into the house. What truth? Thomas demanded, his voice sharp. Sabrina pulled out her phone and played an audio recording for everyone to hear. It was Jack's voice, low and urgent. Greg needs to back off. If he doesn't, I'll make sure he regrets it. The room fell silent as the recording finished. Thomas turned to Jack, his gaze filled with suspicion. What does this mean? It's not what it sounds like, Jack said quickly, his voice defensive. Sabrina smirked. Oh, I think it's exactly what it sounds like. Jack's been playing games, Thomas. With Greg, with Ava, with everyone. Thomas turned to me, his face filled with betrayal. Is this true? Did you know about this? I didn't, I said, but the words felt hollow. Don't lie to me, Ava, Thomas said, his voice shaking. I don't even know who you are anymore. Jack stepped in between us. Leave her out of this, he said firmly. This is all about her. Thomas snapped, you don't think I see that? Jack's jaw tightened. Maybe it has, but you drove her to it. You pursued your career with disregard for her. Don't lecture me about my marriage, Thomas growled. The tension in the room reached its peak, and for a moment, I thought someone would strike. Just then, Greg entered the house without knocking, his expression wild. What's going on here? Thomas demanded. Greg pointed at Jack. He threatened me. He said he'd ruin me if I didn't keep quiet. Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You've been blackmailing us. Don't portray yourself as the victim. Blackmail? Thomas repeated, disbelief written across his face. Greg glared at Jack with venom. As you are entitled to be informed about the events that have transpired within your residence. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, accusations flying. Finally, Thomas slammed his fist on the counter. Enough, he shouted. I don't care who started this. I want all of you out of my house now. I felt the weight of his words crushing me. Thomas, please, I said. Save it, he said coldly. I'll have the divorce papers ready by the end of the week. Jack's face darkened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes full of regret. I'll wait for you outside, he said softly before leaving the room. I stood on the porch, watching Jack load his car. The ache in my chest grew. This wasn't how I wanted it to end. It doesn't have to end, Jack said quietly as he turned to me. I hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I can't, I said finally, tears streaming down my face. I've already lost too much. Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. I understand. Without another word, he got into his car and drove away, leaving me standing in the cold. In the days that followed, the fallout consumed me. Clara called repeatedly, concerned, but I couldn't face her. Thomas moved into a hotel, leaving the house eerily empty. I spent my nights staring out at the garden, replaying every choice that had led me to this point. The passion, the risks, the lies, they had all come at a cost I wasn't sure I could bear. But despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. For the first time in years, I had felt alive, even if it had all ended in ruin. This story takes us on an emotional rollercoaster, exploring the complex web of relationships, secrets, and the consequences of our actions. It shows how a seemingly innocent situation can quickly spiral out of control, leaving lives in shambles. Ava and Jack's relationship challenges our traditional notions of family and loyalty. It makes us question the boundaries of right and wrong in matters of the heart. What would you have done if you were in Ava's position? How do we navigate the powerful emotions that can arise in difficult circumstances? This narrative also highlights the importance of honesty and communication in relationships. If Ava and Jack had been more open about their feelings from the start, could they have avoided this painful outcome? Share your thoughts and experiences, and let's engage in a meaningful discussion about the choices we make and the impact they have on our lives and the lives of those around us.